The first light of dawn spread across Willow Creek Valley, painting the misty fields gold. It was the kind of morning that felt older than time itself, the smell of dew, the rustle of the corn stalks, and the proud crow of a rooster cutting through the silence. To most folks, that sound meant life, a new day beginning, nature's alarm clock echoing across the countryside. But for one person, it meant war. Miles Hartman had lived on his family's land since birth. His grandfather had built the red barn himself, every beam soaked in sweat and stories. For 3 generations, the Hartmans had raised chickens, cattle, and crops under the same endless sky. Miles was the last of them now, a man who understood the rhythm of rural life. And in that rhythm, nothing was more loyal than Rusty, his old rooster. Every morning at exactly 5:12 a.m., Rusty crowed from the fence post, his voice cutting across the fog like a battle cry of the earth itself. But the peace of Willow Creek was broken the moment Karen Hollings moved in. She was what locals called a city transplant, a sharp-tongued, designer-suited woman who bought a large farmhouse on the edge of the HOA development. The HOA, known as Maple Ridge Estates, had been creeping outward for years, buying old farmland and turning it into country-style luxury living. When Karen arrived, she saw the country not as a way of life but as a backdrop, a quiet, Instagram-perfect setting for her manicured dreams. Her first week there, she smiled politely at Miles from her pristine white SUV, waving as she passed by. Her second week, she posted in the Maple Ridge HOA Facebook group about unacceptable morning noise. By the third week, she filed her first complaint. The letter came in a clean white envelope, stamped with the official HOA seal. It read like a court order, cold, impersonal, and dripping with entitlement. The board had received multiple complaints about noise violations originating from animal activity on Miles's property. The HOA demanded immediate action, relocate or silence the rooster or face daily fines. Miles stared at the letter for a long time. The idea that anyone would try to control the sound of a rooster in the countryside was absurd. Rusty wasn't just a bird, he was part of the land, part of the heartbeat of every morning that made the valley what it was. But Karen didn't see it that way. She had convinced the board that her peaceful lifestyle was being disturbed. The HOA president, a man named Leonard Price, lived 2 streets away from Karen and had ambitions of running for county office. He saw her complaints as a chance to appear pro-community, so he acted fast. Soon, official notices began stacking up. Fines, threats of legal action, even suggestions that Rusty violated a zoning ordinance, an ordinance that had been drafted to limit industrial livestock farms, not a single rooster. But technicalities never stopped an HOA on a power trip. Karen's smugness grew with every letter. She began walking her tiny dog, Peaches, along the property line at dawn, glaring toward Miles's barn whenever Rusty crowed. She complained in neighborhood meetings, talking about respect and modern standards. Her voice carried over the microphones like a weapon wrapped in civility. Still, Miles refused to bend. He cleaned his coop, kept his animals penned, followed every code he could find. But Rusty crowed on, loyal and loud, echoing defiance into the morning air. The other locals noticed. Some smiled, saying it was about time someone stood up to the Maple Ridge HOA. Others warned Miles that they never lost, that fighting them was like trying to stop a flood with bare hands. Then one morning, Karen recorded the crow. She uploaded it to the HOA group, captioned, "Would you want to wake up to this every day? Some of us value peace and quiet." Country chaos. The post exploded with comments. Some residents sided with her, complaining about farm smells and barnyard noise. Others defended Miles, arguing that this was farmland long before the HOA arrived. But to Karen, this wasn't a debate, it was a crusade. She wanted the rooster gone. 2 days later, a county inspector showed up unannounced. He checked the property lines, the noise levels, even took photos of the barn. Miles watched in silence as the man scribbled on his clipboard, his expression tight with discomfort. It was clear someone powerful had made a call. That evening, as the sun bled red behind the hills, Miles sat on his porch watching Rusty strut proudly across the yard. The air was quiet except for the chirp of crickets and the faint hum of the highway in the distance. He realized something then: this wasn't just about a rooster. It was about control, about outsiders coming in and rewriting the rules of a place that had stood for generations. The next morning, the HOA issued a formal demand: remove the rooster within 48 hours or face a lawsuit. Miles folded the letter, placed it on the table, and stared at it until the words blurred. Then he stood, walked out to the barn, and looked at Rusty perched high on the beam. The bird tilted his head, proud and unafraid. Something inside Miles hardened. He wasn't just going to fight, he was going to expose them. Every smug email, every abuse of power, every lie hidden under the polished surface of the HOA's smile. The city woman wanted silence. She was about to hear the loudest message the countryside had ever sent. As dawn broke the next day, Rusty crowed louder than ever, a sound that carried across the hills like the first note of war. The days that followed were tense, like the heavy stillness before a summer storm. The HOA board, emboldened by Karen's persistence, moved from warnings to open aggression. They no longer spoke in veiled threats or legal jargon, they came for Miles with everything they had. On Monday morning, the notice arrived nailed to his front gate, sealed with the official Maple Ridge Estates emblem. The paper flapped in the wind like a white flag that wasn't surrender, it was a declaration of war. The letter stated that Miles Hartman was in violation of community noise ordinances, and that further noncompliance would result in escalating daily fines, property liens, and potential foreclosure proceedings if the situation was not resolved. For the first time, the HOA wasn't just going after a man, they were going after his legacy. Inside her spotless home, Karen smiled as she typed up her next post. Her tone was polished, professional, even sympathetic, the kind that made her look like a victim. She wrote about rural respect, about neighbors who don't understand progress. Her words carried the venom of pride hidden behind a mask of civility. She ended her post with a final jab. Some of us moved here for peace and quiet. If people want to live like it's 1950, maybe they should move further out. It didn't take long for the board to rally behind her. HOA President Leonard Price held an emergency meeting. Miles wasn't invited, but word traveled fast in a small town. Leonard was known for his arrogance, a man who wore his authority like a sheriff's badge. He'd been waiting for an issue to flex his influence, and Karen's crusade gave him the perfect excuse. They voted unanimously to fine Miles $500 a day until the rooster was removed or silenced. They framed it as protecting property values. To them, Rusty wasn't a bird. He was a threat to the image they were selling, modern luxury in a country-style community. When the notice reached him, Miles didn't flinch. He folded the paper, set it on his kitchen counter, and walked out into the field. Rusty was there, perched proudly on the fence, watching the horizon as if he sensed the storm brewing. The morning sun caught the red of his feathers, glowing like fire. Miles realized something as he stood there: the HOA didn't understand this land. They didn't understand what it meant to work it, to earn every inch through sweat and soil. They saw control, rules, money, but the countryside had its own justice. It moved slower, quieter, but when it struck, it hit harder than any law. By midweek, HOA inspectors began driving by in shiny black SUVs, stopping at the edge of his property, taking pictures, pretending to measure noise. They left warning tags on his gate. Some of the newer neighbors stopped waving when they passed by. The whispers had started about the stubborn farmer who couldn't let go of his rooster. But the old locals, the ones who'd been around long before Maple Ridge was ever built, started showing up at his porch. They brought coffee, fresh bread, and quiet support. They told stories of their own battles with developers, of land sold and land stolen. One old man told him they hate what they can't own. Miles took those words to heart. Then late one night he heard something. A truck engine idling near his fence line. He stepped outside, flashlight in hand, just in time to see two figures near the barn. They froze under the beam of light, startled, one of them holding a net. Before he could speak, they bolted into the dark, their tires spitting gravel as they tore down the road. When he reached the barn, the coop door was open. Rusty was gone. For the first time in years, the dawn was silent. No crow, no morning song, just the empty ache of loss hanging in the fog. Miles searched everywhere, through the tall grass, down by the creek, even into the neighboring lots. Nothing. Whoever had taken Rusty had done it clean, fast, and with purpose. The kind of act that didn't happen without someone giving an order. By noon, Karen posted a message in the HOA group again, feigning ignorance but dripping with satisfaction. Finally got a peaceful morning today, smiling face with smiling eyes, maybe the countryside's learning to adapt. It was all Miles needed to see. Her arrogance gave her away, but instead of anger, something colder settled in him: focus. The kind that sharpened a man's instincts. He'd spent years fixing engines, tending crops, and building fences strong enough to outlast storms. Now he would build something else, a plan. He started quietly. He gathered every document the HOA had ever sent him. He printed every email, every complaint, every post Karen had made. He noticed inconsistencies, rules applied to some and ignored for others. Photos of HOA board members throwing parties after curfew, parking RVs on prohibited lots, even one of Leonard's illegal addition to his garage. They had buried themselves in hypocrisy, and Miles was about to dig it all up. But he wasn't just thinking of revenge, he was thinking of justice. Real country-style justice. The kind that didn't need courts or paperwork, just truth and timing. That night, under a sky filled with stars, he set up motion cameras around his property. He wired old microphones near the coop. If they came again, he'd have proof. 3 days later, the camera caught something. At 2:17 a.m., a car pulled up, the same SUV that had been making inspection rounds. The headlights flashed once. A door opened. Karen stepped out. She looked around, then tossed a small, struggling shape from a crate. Rusty, alive, disheveled. She didn't say a word. Just turned and drove away. When the first light touched the fields again, Rusty crowed, broken at first, then louder, fiercer, like the sound of defiance itself. Miles smiled. The silence was over. And the next move, it wouldn't be a complaint, it would be a reckoning. The morning Rusty crowed again felt different. It wasn't just the sound of a rooster greeting the dawn, it was the echo of a promise of resistance. A declaration that the countryside wouldn't bow to the polished rules of city arrogance. Miles stood on his porch, coffee steaming in his calloused hand, watching the golden fog lift off his fields. Rusty perched atop the weathered fence post, feathers gleaming, chest puffed with pride. He looked thinner, dirt on his wings, but his spirit was untamed. The sound of his crow rolled across the valley like thunder. Miles didn't rush to call the sheriff or the board or anyone. He had something better: proof. When he reviewed the footage that afternoon, every detail played out clear as day. The dark SUV, the way it crept along the fence line, the unmistakable flash of Karen Holling's blonde hair under the porch light. The camera caught her perfectly the moment she threw Rusty from that crate like a piece of garbage, the cruel smirk on her face before she vanished into the night. For a long while, Miles said nothing. He just sat in silence, the soft cluck of chickens in the background, the old camera footage flickering on his dusty laptop screen. Then slowly he smiled. He had her, but exposing her wasn't enough. He needed to show the world what this HOA had become, how far they'd fallen from the ideals they pretended to uphold. The arrogance, the hypocrisy, the cruelty hiding behind every violation notice. He knew exactly how to do it. At evening he uploaded the footage to a private file and started editing. He didn't need fancy effects, just the truth told simply. He titled the video "When the HOA Tries to Silence a Rooster and Fails." He added a short clip of Rusty crowing at sunrise, followed by the footage of Karen sneaking in and dumping the bird. He blurred her license plate but left her face crystal clear. Then he added one final touch, a line of text across the screen. They tried to silence the countryside. But you can't silence the dawn. When the upload finished, Miles posted it on a few local groups, rural homeowners, small-town community boards, even one page dedicated to HOA horror stories. He didn't expect much, maybe a few comments, a handful of shares. By sunrise the next day it had over 20,000 views, by noon it hit 200,000, and by nightfall it crossed 1 million. The comments flooded in. Thousands of people, farmers, ranchers, country folk, and city dwellers alike were outraged. They couldn't believe the pettiness, the cruelty. Karen's face became the symbol of everything wrong with overreaching HOAs. Viewers called her the Rooster Thief, Feather Karen, and the Queen of Noise Complaints. News outlets began calling it the Rusty Rooster Incident. Within 48 hours, memes, reaction videos, and even parody songs began spreading online. A country musician uploaded a short tune titled "Rusty Crowed First," and it hit 500,000 plays in a week. Miles had unintentionally started a movement, but while the world was laughing, the HOA board was in chaos. Leonard Price, the president, called an emergency closed-door meeting. He wanted damage control fast. Karen had already called him in tears, claiming she was being harassed and taken out of context. But the video spoke for itself, and the public wasn't buying her excuses. The HOA's official website was bombarded with messages, complaints, and mockery. Sponsors pulled out of their planned Maple Ridge expansion project. The board's reputation, once polished and untouchable, was in freefall. Still, Leonard tried to contain the fire. He drafted a press statement calling the video incomplete and potentially misleading. He even threatened to sue Miles for defamation. But that backfired spectacularly. The threat only made the story grow. Lawyers, influencers, and even local journalists came to Miles's defense. Meanwhile, Karen's life began to unravel. Neighbors who once admired her started avoiding her. People whispered at grocery stores. Peaches, her little white dog, barked nervously when reporters showed up at her gate. But Karen wasn't done fighting. She doubled down, filing another complaint, this time accusing Miles of defamatory behavior, emotional harassment, and animal endangerment. She claimed Rusty had attacked her dog. It was absurd, desperate, and transparently false, but she didn't care. She wanted revenge for her humiliation. The HOA, already bleeding credibility, decided to stand behind her. They issued a new fine against Miles, this time for online misconduct damaging to community image. That was their mistake, because this time Miles wasn't the one on the defensive. He was watching, recording, and preparing his next move. He gathered everything: video clips of HOA vehicles parked illegally on his land, recordings of Leonard's inspectors trespassing, screenshots of messages where Karen bragged about fixing the noise problem. He compiled it all into a new video, a sequel to the first one. But this one wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had ever been bullied by an HOA, hiding behind fake smiles and endless paperwork. He called it the HOA that hated the countryside. When he uploaded it, he didn't share it in small groups this time. He sent it to journalists. He tagged major news outlets. He even sent it to a lawyer who had gone viral years earlier for exposing another HOA scandal. Within 24 hours, the story hit national news. Reporters stood at the entrance of Maple Ridge Estates, interviewing neighbors who described the board as tyrannical and obsessed with control. Karen refused to speak. Leonard, red-faced and trembling, issued a short, furious statement about privacy violations before retreating from public view. But the damage was done. Rusty became an online symbol. His crowing sound clip was used in thousands of videos, from memes to protest edits. Someone even made a ringtone out of it. People began saying, "You can't silence the rooster," as a phrase meaning you can't silence the truth. Miles didn't ask for fame, he didn't want attention. All he wanted was his peace, the kind that comes from standing your ground and refusing to be trampled. But as the views climbed past 5 million, he realized something powerful. This wasn't just his fight anymore. It was every small landowner's fight. Every farmer, every rancher, every person who had ever been told by outsiders how to live on their own soil. And as Rusty crowed again under the blazing sunrise, Miles knew the war wasn't over. The HOA would retaliate, but this time they weren't dealing with just a farmer. They were dealing with a man who had the world watching. The storm that followed Rusty's viral fame wasn't made of thunder or rain. It was made of paperwork, whispers, and quiet acts of retaliation. The HOA had been humiliated on a national scale. Their image, once pristine and polished, was now a laughingstock. Memes of Karen's face beside a crowing rooster flooded the internet. Late-night hosts joked about the HOA that declared war on a chicken. And Leonard Price, the once powerful president, had become the unwilling face of suburban corruption. But humiliation breeds vengeance. The first sign came in the mail, a thick envelope with bold red letters reading Final Notice of Delinquency. Inside were printed records of accumulated fines, noise violations, public defamation, noncompliance with community image standards, and even failure to maintain landscaping in a manner consistent with Maple Ridge guidelines. The total owed, $48,750. Miles read the number, exhaled once, and set the letter down. The air around him felt heavier, thicker. He knew they were trying to break him, but they didn't understand something essential: he wasn't playing by their rules anymore. Karen, meanwhile, had gone quiet. Her once busy HOA posts had disappeared. Her car no longer appeared at board meetings. But quiet didn't mean surrender, it meant plotting. She had friends on the board, and together they began working behind closed doors, searching for a way to strike back without public attention. Their plan was simple, cruel, and perfectly legal: revoke his land, grandfathered zoning protection. If they succeeded, Miles's property would be forcibly absorbed into the Maple Ridge HOA boundaries, stripping him of his independence. His land would fall under their jurisdiction, his animals subject to their rules. In their hands, it was the perfect punishment, a slow suffocation disguised as bureaucracy. But Miles wasn't ignorant. He'd been expecting a move like this, and he wasn't alone. The viral fame had drawn allies, a small army of online supporters who despised HOA corruption. Among them was a retired county clerk, a property lawyer, and even a well-known YouTuber who specialized in exposing community board abuse. They reached out privately, offering help, advice, and resources. Within a week, Miles had assembled his own version of an investigation team. They dug into Maple Ridge's records, uncovering things the board never thought would see daylight: secret amendments passed without resident votes, misuse of maintenance funds, and undeclared financial relationships between Leonard and a local developer. Every discovery was another nail in the HOA's coffin. But the real turning point came when they found an email chain, one between Karen and Leonard, dated weeks before the video scandal. In it, Karen explicitly asked if there was a way to remove or relocate the farmer next door before summer, citing noise, smell, and general eyesore concerns. Leonard had replied with a chillingly simple message: "Don't worry, we'll make it happen quietly." The moment Miles read it, he knew he had what he needed. He gathered every file, every photo, every recording. Then, instead of posting another video, he did something different, something calculated. He sent the entire dossier directly to a local journalist who had been covering HOA corruption stories for months. A journalist who hated bullies as much as he did. 3 days later, the front page of the Willow Creek Gazette bore the headline: "Maple Ridge HOA under investigation for abuse of power and zoning fraud." The article tore the board apart. Names, emails, financial records, all laid bare. Local officials launched a review. Residents began demanding answers. For the first time, the HOA board wasn't the one giving orders, they were on the defensive. Karen's perfect world began to crumble. Her employer, a real estate agency in town, placed her on temporary leave pending public fallout. Her phone number leaked, and her inbox filled with messages from furious strangers. She tried to play victim again, but nobody believed her. The image of her tossing Rusty from that crate had burned itself into the internet's collective memory. As the walls closed in, the HOA board grew desperate. They called an emergency community meeting. But this time it wasn't in the glossy clubhouse, it was in the old town hall, under flickering lights and the watchful eyes of residents who no longer trusted them. Leonard tried to speak, his voice trembling as he talked about false information, misunderstandings, and a coordinated smear campaign. But every word he said was met with silence, a cold, heavy silence that told him his reign was over. Then, near the back of the room, a voice spoke. Calm, steady, familiar, it was Miles. He didn't shout, he didn't accuse. He simply stood and told them the truth: how he'd been threatened, fined, harassed, and silenced for simply living the same way his family had for 3 generations. How the HOA had twisted the idea of community into a weapon for control. Every word hit like a hammer, and when he finished, there was no applause, no outrage, just the quiet shift of people realizing what they'd become part of. By the next morning, 3 HOA board members had resigned. Leonard went into hiding. Karen sold her house within a week, moving back to the city that once accepted her vanity. But the HOA wasn't dead yet. Before leaving, Leonard filed one final motion, a legal claim accusing Miles of defamation resulting in financial damages. It was a last-ditch effort to drain him, to make him pay for their downfall. For most men, it would have worked, but Miles had already prepared for this. With the help of his new allies, he built a defense, airtight, undeniable, and backed by evidence. Not only would he prove his innocence, but he'd also expose the HOA's lawsuit for what it really was: retaliation. And as the sun dipped behind the hills that evening, the rooster crowed again, not in defiance but in warning. The war wasn't just public anymore. It was headed to the courtroom. The courthouse in Willow Creek wasn't built for drama. It was a squat brick building at the edge of town, its walls lined with faded portraits of long-gone judges and sheriffs. But on the morning of the Maple Ridge HOA versus Miles Hartman hearing, the place felt like the center of the world. Reporters crowded the front steps. Camera crews set up tripods under the gray dawn. Locals who'd followed the Rooster War, as they now called it, packed the benches. For months, everyone had watched the story unfold online, the viral video, the scandal, the resignations, but now it was time for the final reckoning. Inside, Miles sat quietly at the defendant's table, his hat resting in his lap, his hands folded. He wasn't a man of courtrooms or speeches. He was a man of soil, of seasons, of things that made sense when the world around him didn't. But even he understood that this day wasn't just about him, it was about principle, about freedom, about standing against something that had bullied too many for too long. Across the room sat the remnants of the Maple Ridge board, their expensive suits out of place against the small-town wood paneling. Leonard Price looked older now, his once slick confidence cracked. Karen sat beside him, her eyes hidden behind dark glasses, her posture rigid and cold. The HOA's attorney was young, sharp, and smug, a corporate shark from the city, hired to make an example out of Miles. He argued that the viral videos had defamed the Maple Ridge community, causing property values to drop and reputations to suffer. He painted Miles as a vindictive recluse, a man incapable of coexisting with progress. When he spoke, his words dripped with polished venom. He gestured toward the screen where the viral footage was displayed, freezing on the moment Karen tossed the rooster from the crate. He called it taken out of context. He claimed the video had been manipulated for online outrage. But Miles's attorney, a retired county lawyer named Judith Crane, had no interest in theatrics. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't embellish, she simply let the truth speak. She began with documents, zoning laws, exemption records, and county permits that proved Miles's land predated the HOA's authority. Then came the emails, the ones between Leonard and Karen. The words "make it happen" quietly echoed through the courtroom like a confession. Finally, she played the full footage from that night, unedited, raw, and timestamped. The sound of the car, the headlights, the unmistakable image of Karen at the fence line. The courtroom fell silent. Even the judge, an old man with decades of quiet authority, leaned forward, his face hardening as the truth played out before him. When the clip ended, Judith didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The silence was louder than any argument. Karen trembled slightly, her jaw tightening. Leonard whispered something to his attorney, but the young man's confidence was gone. The jury watched them both with cold eyes. Then came the testimony. Locals took the stand, farmers, neighbors, small-town business owners, each describing the same story. The HOA's abuse of power, the endless fines, the bullying hidden behind fake smiles. One by one, they painted a picture of a community poisoned by greed and arrogance. By afternoon, the case had shifted entirely. The HOA was no longer the plaintiff. They were the villain. The judge recessed briefly before returning with an expression that left no doubt of his decision. His voice when he spoke was calm but final, the kind of voice that carried weight because it didn't need to shout. He dismissed the HOA's lawsuit with prejudice, citing malicious intent and misuse of authority. Then, in a move that stunned the courtroom, he referred the entire Maple Ridge board to the County Ethics Commission for investigation. The sound of chairs creaking, muffled gasps, and whispered relief filled the air. Karen covered her face with her hands. Leonard stared straight ahead, expression blank, but the judge wasn't finished. He turned his gaze to Miles, not as a defendant but as a man who had endured. "Mr. Hartman," he said, "you have demonstrated remarkable patience under pressure. Your property, your animals, and your livelihood are protected under county law. You owe no fines, no restitution, and no explanation." For the first time in months, Miles felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel: peace. As he stepped outside into the cool afternoon air, the crowd erupted. Reporters shouted questions, supporters cheered, but Miles just smiled faintly and tipped his hat. He wasn't interested in fame. He'd already won what mattered most: his freedom. That evening, back on his land, the sky burned with a deep red sunset. The fields glowed golden under the last light of day. Rusty stood proud on the fence post, crowing into the wind as if announcing victory to the whole valley. But the story didn't end there. The fallout from the trial spread fast. News outlets ran headlines: "Farmer defeats HOA in viral rooster case." Other homeowners began coming forward with their own stories, inspired by Miles's stand. A national conversation began about HOA power, rural rights, and community corruption. Karen vanished from public view. Her house went up for sale quietly, and within weeks a new family, a young couple with 2 children and a love for farm life, moved in. The sound of laughter replaced the constant complaints. Leonard resigned from all local committees and left town under investigation for embezzlement. The Maple Ridge HOA dissolved soon after, its members too divided and discredited to continue. For the first time in years, Willow Creek felt like a community again, not a collection of property lines and rules but a place where people looked out for one another. As night fell, Miles walked out to the barn, lantern light flickering across the old wooden beams. Rusty roosted above, his feathers ruffling gently in the breeze. Miles smiled, reaching up to rest his hand on the post. He thought of all the months of noise, the anger, the fear, and how a single rooster's crow had turned it all upside down. He didn't set out to be a hero, he just refused to be silenced. And that somehow was enough to wake more than just the HOA board. It had woken an entire nation to what silence costs. As the stars came out, Rusty crowed one last time, his voice rising over the quiet land like a victory anthem. And in that moment, the countryside, vast, proud, and unbroken, finally exhaled. Months had passed since the courtroom showdown that shook Maple Ridge to its core. The dust had settled, but the echoes of what happened still lingered across the valley. What began as a small-town dispute had become a symbol, a quiet rebellion that spread far beyond Willow Creek. Out here in the open country, things had a way of healing slow but sure. The land never forgot, but it forgave through rain that softened the earth, through wind that cleared the air, through seasons that taught patience. Miles Hartman had returned fully to his life, the one he'd fought so hard to protect. The fields were thriving again, the fences rebuilt, the barn freshly painted in a deep red that glowed at sunrise. The farmhouse, once shadowed by conflict, now buzzed with peace. Rusty, the rooster at the center of it all, strutted proudly across the yard each morning, crowing as the first light spilled over the hills. His voice, once the target of threats and petitions, was now a badge of honor, a sound that meant freedom still lived here. Neighbors began stopping by more often now. Some came to share stories, others to thank him. A few brought pies, jars of jam, or just company. They spoke of how the video had inspired them, how they'd stood up to their own HOAs, filed complaints, and demanded fairness. One family, newly moved into Maple Ridge, told Miles they'd chosen the community because of him. "We wanted to live somewhere real," the father had said, "not where people measure your grass but where they know your name." The irony wasn't lost on Miles. The same place that once tried to silence him had become a refuge for those seeking the life he fought for. Online, the story still circulated. The Rooster vs. HOA saga had become a folk tale of sorts, shared by news anchors, comedians, even politicians. A clip of Rusty crowing outside the courthouse had been used in hundreds of memes. But beneath the humor was a message people understood. That silence is the first victory of control, and noise, even a rooster's, is sometimes the truest sound of resistance. Miles didn't care much for the fame. He never checked the comments, never watched the interviews. He spent his days fixing tractors, mending wire, and tending to his animals. But every once in a while, he'd get a letter, handwritten, sealed, and sincere. One came from a retired rancher in Texas who'd fought his own HOA for the right to keep horses. Another came from a widow in Oregon who said she'd plant a small garden despite the community rules. Each letter ended the same way: "Thank you for standing your ground." But peace never came without ghosts. Sometimes late at night, when the wind moved through the trees, Miles would remember Karen's face, the anger, the arrogance, and beneath it all the fear. Not fear of him, but of losing control. He didn't hate her anymore, he just pitied her. People like that weren't born cruel, they were shaped by walls they mistook for homes. One afternoon, while fixing a gate near the property line, Miles noticed a car slow to a stop on the dirt road, a black sedan. The window rolled down, and for a brief moment he saw her, Karen, sitting behind the wheel. Her hair was shorter now, her expression unreadable. She didn't step out, didn't speak. Just looked out toward the farmhouse, toward Rusty perched high on the fence. Then faintly the rooster crowed. Karen flinched. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched Miles's lips. She rolled up the window and drove away without a word. That was the last time he ever saw her. By autumn, life in Willow Creek had moved on. The HOA was officially dissolved, replaced by a small, volunteer-run neighborhood council that focused on community projects instead of punishments. They helped elderly neighbors repair fences, organize crop swaps, and rebuilt the community barn that had stood empty for years. At the grand reopening, they invited Miles to cut the ribbon. He refused at first, saying it wasn't his kind of spotlight. But they insisted, not out of ceremony but gratitude. That evening, under golden lights strung across the rafters, Miles stood before his neighbors, farmers, families, and the same people who'd once feared the HOA's power. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but steady. He said that community wasn't built by rules but by respect. That freedom wasn't loud until someone tried to take it away. And that sometimes the smallest things, a rooster's crow, a man's stand, could wake an entire town. When he finished, Rusty crowed from outside the barn door and the crowd laughed and cheered. It was perfect timing, almost like he knew the moment belonged to him too. As night deepened, music filled the barn, fiddles, harmonicas, boots tapping on the wooden floor. Kids chased each other through hay bales, lanterns swayed, and for the first time in years, Maple Ridge felt alive again. Miles stepped outside for air. The sky was clear, the stars endless. The sound of laughter carried softly over the fields. He leaned on the fence, listening to Rusty's faint calls echoing across the land. There was peace in that sound, not silence, not chaos, just life the way it was meant to be. He looked out over the horizon at the dark outline of his fields and felt something deep inside settle at last. He won not through anger or violence but through truth and endurance, the kind of victory that lasts because it comes from patience, not pride. Tomorrow the rooster would crow again, as he always had. And miles away, in homes and towns that would never meet, others would wake to that story, a reminder that even the smallest voice can carry farther than anyone expects. For in the end, it wasn't just a story about a man and his rooster. It was about the sound of freedom, raw, defiant, and unbroken, echoing through the heart of the countryside. And that sound would never be silenced again. The years rolled forward like slow rivers, carving new paths through familiar soil. What began as a fight between one man and an HOA had turned into something much larger, something no one in Willow Creek could have predicted. By the time 2 years had passed, the rooster story had become legend. It wasn't just a viral video anymore. It had turned into a living parable told around campfires, taught in law classes, even featured in documentaries about rural rights. The world, in its hunger for control and conformity, had found something raw and real in the defiance of one old farmer and his proud bird. But for Miles Hartman, life hadn't changed much. He still rose with the sun, still worked the land with his bare hands, and still began each day to the sound of Rusty's triumphant crow. The farmhouse had grown quieter but fuller in spirit. The peace he'd fought for had settled into every corner of his land. Visitors came less often now, but those who did came with purpose. Reporters, law students, even small-town leaders hopping to learn how to balance progress with peace. Miles welcomed them kindly, but always reminded them of one thing: don't turn freedom into a story, live it. The seasons had come full circle again. The winter had been harsh, but the spring was kind. Wildflowers pushed up through the edges of his fence lines, and the orchard he'd planted years ago began to bear fruit. Rusty, though older now, was still the loudest voice in the valley. His feathers had dulled, his steps slower, but when dawn came he sang with the same untamed pride that had once shaken an entire boardroom. But change has a way of finding even those who wish only to be left alone. One morning a black SUV rolled down the gravel road, too clean, too quiet for country roads. It stopped by the gate and a man in a gray suit stepped out. He wasn't from around there, that much was obvious from the shine of his shoes. He introduced himself as a representative from a new rural development partnership, looking to purchase parcels of farmland across Willow Creek. He handed Miles a folder, thick papers, maps, and signatures already stamped in ink. The offer was generous, almost too generous. Miles didn't open it. He simply looked past the man, toward his fields, the windmill, and the weathered fence posts that had stood longer than most of the houses in town. "This land's not for sale," he said evenly. The man smiled, not kindly but politely, the kind of smile that hid pressure behind politeness. He said others in the area had already agreed that progress was coming whether anyone liked it or not. But Miles just nodded slowly and turned back toward the barn. Rusty crowed from his perch, breaking the tense silence. The man flinched at the sound, muttered something under his breath, and got back into his car. That night, under the pale light of the moon, Miles sat on his porch watching the road. The air carried a faint unease, the kind that comes before change. He knew what that visit meant. Someone was coming again for the land. Only this time it wasn't an HOA, it was something bigger, quieter, and much better funded. But he wasn't afraid. He had faced worse and won. Days passed. Rumors spread across Willow Creek. The partnership had plans to turn the nearby meadows into luxury cabins and private lodges. Many neighbors, weary from years of low prices and hard winters, began to consider selling. The promise of quick money gleamed like bait in front of them. Miles tried to warn them. He reminded them what happened last time outsiders came with smiles and contracts. Some listened, some didn't. Then one evening he found a notice nailed to his gate, a formal letter of intent from the development firm. They claimed his land was part of a priority zone essential to their project. He was being encouraged to accept a buyout before further steps were taken. He laughed softly, shaking his head. History, it seemed, had a bad habit of repeating itself. But this time he wasn't alone. The people of Willow Creek remembered. The ones who'd once feared rules and fines now stood ready to protect their town. They'd seen how one man's quiet defiance had toppled a corrupt HOA. Now they were ready to defend their soil from something far larger. When the developers held a town meeting at the new community hall, the turnout shocked them. Dozens of locals filled the seats: farmers, teachers, retired veterans, and families who'd once been silent. And at the center, as calm as ever, sat Miles. He didn't speak much. He didn't need to. His presence was enough, a living reminder that land isn't just dirt, it's memory. When the developers tried to pitch their plans, slideshows, promises, economic growth, the crowd listened quietly. Then an older woman, one of Miles's neighbors, stood up and said, "We've already seen what happens when you let outsiders tell us what we can do with our land. We're not making that mistake twice." The applause that followed wasn't loud, it was thunderous. By the end of the night, the developers left frustrated, their proposal rejected by unanimous vote. The partnership dissolved within months, moving on to another county, another easy target. Life in Willow Creek went back to its steady rhythm, slow, honest, and unbroken. And Rusty still crowed every morning, a little raspier now, but with the same defiant pride that once rattled courtroom walls. To outsiders it was just a sound. But to those who lived there it was something sacred, the echo of a fight that never truly ended and a freedom that refused to fade. Years later, when Rusty finally passed peacefully under the old oak tree, Miles buried him on the hill overlooking the valley. He marked the grave with a small wooden cross that read simply, "He woke them all." Every dawn after that, Miles would still rise early, half expecting to hear that familiar crow. And though silence now filled the mornings, it never felt empty. Because in that silence there lived a memory, a sound that had once carried through the hills, through the courtrooms, through the noise of the world, and into the hearts of those who listened. The sound of one rooster, the sound of one man's stand, the sound of freedom that never died. And even when Miles was gone, when the farmhouse aged and the seasons turned, the people of Willow Creek kept that sound alive. They told it to their children, and their children told it again, how one voice, no matter how small, can wake the world.